Get your hands off the wheel and step out of the car. Right now. The voice came through the rain like a hammer against glass, and Ambassador Julian Ashworth did not move. Not because he was afraid, because he had learned, over 30 years of standing in rooms where men with guns and men with treaties tried to outstare each other, that the first person to flinch is the first person to lose. Before we go further, let's rewind 11 minutes, back to the moment none of this needed to happen at all. The rain over Chaston Hills, on the northern edge of Atlanta, fell in long silver ropes that night, drumming against the hood of a black 2025 Range Rover gliding down Peachtree Ridge Parkway at exactly 43 miles an hour. Inside, the climate control hummed at 71 degrees. A single reading lamp glowed over the passenger seat, illuminating a stack of briefing papers stamped confidential. Unisicus Kunsil, Session 4471. The scent of leather and rain-soaked asphalt drifted through a cracked window. Ashworth, 54 years old, silver, threading through close-cropped hair, wore a charcoal wool suit that had been tailored on Savile Row 9 years earlier, and still fit him like a second skin. He was not thinking about the weather. He was thinking about his father. In the back of his mind, that was always where the night ended up, no matter where it started. Behind him, headlights bloomed red and blue against the wet windshield. He didn't swerve. He didn't panic. He signaled, eased the Range Rover onto the gravel shoulder, shifted into park, and turned on the dome light, exactly the way his father had taught him 40 years earlier, in a much smaller car, on a much poorer street, in a city 300 miles from here. Both hands 10 and 2, window down 3 inches, no more, no less. Wait. Some habits are inherited, some are armor. Officer Dale Whitmore stepped out of his cruiser without checking the plate. If he had looked, he would have seen the navy and white diplomatic tag issued by the U.S. Department of State, the letter D stamped clean across the top left corner, meaning full immunity under federal law. He didn't look. Whitmore had been on the force for 16 years, had a jaw like a closed fist, and a reputation at the 14th precinct that his union representative had spent a decade quietly managing. What Whitmore saw, through sheets of rain and the glare of his own flashlight, was a black man behind the wheel of a $110,000 SUV, alone, at 11:52 p.m., in a neighborhood where the median home price ran $2.3 million. That was enough information for Dale Whitmore. It always had been. License and registration now. Good evening, officer. Ashworth's voice was a deep, unhurried baritone, entirely without tremor. I'm reaching for my identification in my breast pocket. Is that acceptable to you? Just make it quick. Ashworth withdrew a slim leather folio and slid a card through the gap in the window. It was not a Georgia driver's license. It was heavier, laminated in a way no ordinary card could be, bearing a gold federal seal and a holographic strip that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in fractured color. I am Ambassador Julian Ashworth, Senior Delegate, to the United Nations Economic and Social Council. You'll find my diplomatic status printed on the reverse. Whitmore turned the card over once, twice. Then he laughed, a short, ugly bark that cut through the rain. An ambassador. He said it the way a man says a punchline. He turned toward his rookie partner, 24-year-old Officer Marcus Bell, who was standing 3 feet back, rain sliding off the brim of his cap. Bell, get a load of this, says he's a UN ambassador. Sir, Bell said carefully, if it's a State Department card, the plate should have a D prefix. We should probably just, nobody asked you. Whitmore snapped. He looked back through the window, his eyes hard. You think I'm gonna believe a guy like you is cruising Chastain Hills in a 6-figure truck with a fake badge in your pocket? Where'd you steal this thing, Ambassador? Or is this a joyride? Something in Ashworth's chest went very still and very cold, the way it used to when a hostile delegation tried to bait him in a closed session. He had negotiated ceasefires with men who had ordered massacres. A bigoted patrolman on a wet Georgia highway was, by comparison, almost restful in his predictability. Almost. "I'd advise you to run the plate, officer," Ashworth said quietly. "It is registered to the Office of Foreign Missions. If you confiscate that card, you are in violation of federal statute." Whitmore's answer was to flick his wrist. The card spun off his fingers and landed in the mud and gravel of the shoulder, face down, rain immediately beating across the gold seal. "Step out of the vehicle. Here's the part I want you to remember for later. That card sitting face down in the mud is going to come back. Everything that happens in the next 10 minutes happens because one man decided a piece of plastic on the ground was worth less than his own certainty." Ashworth complied. Resisting an armed and irritated officer on a dark highway at midnight was a decision that could end far worse than an unlawful arrest, diplomatic status or not. He stepped out into the rain, 6'2", and buttoned his suit jacket with a composure that seemed to enrage Whitmore even further. "Hands on the roof, turn around." Whitmore kicked his legs apart hard enough that Ashworth's dress shoe slid on the wet asphalt. He patted him down roughly, finding nothing but a phone, and in the inside pocket, an old black fountain pen with a cracked barrel, its cap worn smooth from decades of handling. "What's this?" Whitmore held it up to the flashlight. "A pen," Ashworth said. "It belonged to my father." Whitmore tossed it onto the passenger seat through the open door without looking at it again. He grabbed Ashworth's wrists and yanked them back hard enough to strain both rotator cuffs, and the cuffs clicked shut, biting into skin already numb from cold. "You are making a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your career," Ashworth said, his voice level as a held note. "Save it for county lockup," Whitmore replied, grinning now, fully enjoying himself. Grand theft, auto, forgery, false ID to a police officer. Let's see how that immunity works from a holding cell. Officer Bell stood frozen in the downpour, rain running off his chin, looking at the muddy gold seal glinting up from the gravel, like something that had crawled out of a grave to accuse him personally. He did not move to pick it up. Not yet. He told himself there would be time later to make it right. That is what people tell themselves in the moment they choose silence. There is almost always a version of themselves waiting somewhere down the road, who they promise will finally do the right thing. The drive to the 14th precinct took 19 minutes. Ashworth sat in the hard plastic back seat, smelling stale coffee and old vinyl, his hands numb behind him, saying nothing at all. It was the silence of a man who did not need to raise his voice, because he already knew with absolute certainty that in less than 12 hours this arrest would detonate into something far larger than Officer Dale Whitmore could survive. If you're wondering how a single wrong turn on a wet highway becomes a federal incident by morning, stay with me, because it gets much worse for Whitmore before it gets better for anyone else. Before that night, before the badge and the rain and the mud, there had been a small kitchen in a row house in southeast Washington, D.C., where an 11-year-old boy named Julian used to sit at a formica table doing homework by the light of a single bulb, while his father, Samuel Ashworth, came home smelling of floor wax and industrial cleaner. Samuel worked nights as a custodian in the Harry S. Truman Building, the very headquarters of the U.S. Department of State, mopping the marble floors that diplomats walked across in the daylight hours, invisible to nearly every person whose meetings he cleaned up after. Samuel kept a fountain pen in his shirt pocket, a pen he had found, unclaimed, in a wastebasket outside the secretary's private conference room in 1987, cracked barrel and all. He gave it to Julian on the boy's 16th birthday and said only, "One day, you're going to walk into that building through the front door, and you're going to write your name on something that matters. Use this pen when you do it." Julian Ashworth had used that pen to sign his very first cable as a junior Foreign Service officer 11 years later. He had used it again the morning he was confirmed as a senior ambassador. He carried it everywhere, in his breast pocket, next to whatever card of state authority he happened to be holding that year. Because his father had died 4 years before he made ambassador, and the pen was the only conversation they still had. That was the reason Julian Ashworth never announced who he was before he had to. His father had spent 31 years being unseen in that building. Julian had made a private, unspoken promise that he would never lead with his title, that people would have to see him, actually see him, before he ever handed them a reason to. It was a kind of test he ran on the world, quietly, over and over. Most of the time, people passed. Dale Whitmore did not. By the time the cruiser pulled into the precinct's Sally Port, water was pooling ankle-deep in the concrete bay. Whitmore hauled Ashworth through the steel doors into the booking room, a fluorescent-lit space where the air smelled of bad coffee and wet uniforms, where 3 men in cuffs sat chained to a bench along the far wall, staring at nothing. At the elevated front desk sat Sergeant Renee Calloway, 22 years on the job, 2 years from a pension she had promised herself she would actually enjoy this time. She looked up with the particular scowl of someone who has seen every kind of Friday night, and was not impressed by another one. "Look what I hauled in, Sarge," Whitmore announced, shoving Ashworth toward the counter with a hand flat against his shoulder blade. Stolen Range Rover, fake federal ID, real attitude. Calloway looked at the ruined charcoal suit. She looked at the posture, spine straight, chin level, not one muscle betraying panic. She had booked 1,000 liars in her career and a few hundred innocent men, and she knew, in the particular way that 22 years teaches a person to know things, that this was neither. "Fake ID?" she asked, cautious. Officer Bell approached the desk, soaked through, holding out the diplomatic card, wiped clean now of the worst of the mud, though a faint gray smear still clung to one corner. He had picked it up from the gravel without a word, while Whitmore wasn't looking. It was the first small thing he had done right all night, and it would not be the last, though he did not know that yet. "Sarge," Bell said quietly, "this looks real. Microprinting's intact. I think we should call a supervisor before we book him." Calloway took the card. She adjusted her reading glasses. She ran a thumb across the raised gold seal, across the security, threading woven into the plastic like a watermark, and then she read the name out loud. "Ambassador Julian Ashworth." "Whitmore," she said, and something in her tone had gone very quiet and very dangerous. "Did you run the plate on that vehicle before you pulled him?" "Didn't need to, Sarge. Guy like that in a truck like that? Come on." The sheer casual weight of that sentence, "guy like that," landed across the booking room and did not lift. Ashworth spoke then, for the first time since the highway, his voice carrying clean across the space. "Sergeant, I have been unlawfully detained, assaulted, and falsely arrested by your officer. My vehicle is sovereign federal property and has been abandoned on a public highway. I want these handcuffs removed, and I want my phone." "Don't listen to him," Whitmore said, waving a hand. "Throw him in holding. We'll sort the paperwork in the morning." Calloway ignored him entirely. She turned to her terminal and typed the ID number from the card into the Federal Diplomatic Registry. The room's low murmur, phones ringing, a drunk man laughing somewhere down the hall, the hiss of a radiator, seemed, for one exact second, to simply stop. The screen returned a red banner, wide and blinking. "Department of State. Critical alerts. Full diplomatic immunity. Julian Ashworth, Senior Ambassador, Un ECOSOC. Do not attend. Do not arrest. Contact Diplomatic Service immediately." Sergeant Renee Calloway did not breathe for 4 full seconds. The rain kept falling outside the barred windows. Somewhere a printer clicked and hummed. Nothing else in that room moved at all. "Whitmore," she finally said, her voice trembling with something that was not yet fear, but would be very soon. "What in God's name did you do? He's obviously—" Whitmore started. "Get the cuffs off him now." Calloway was already standing, already reaching for her own keys, when the door to the precinct captain's office banged open and Captain Douglas Hartley stormed out holding a ringing desk phone in a white-knuckled grip. "Calloway," Hartley barked. "I've got the Diplomatic Security Service on the line, and they are telling me a distress beacon triggered on a vehicle registered to a sitting UN ambassador on the Peachtree Ridge Parkway 40 minutes ago. Somebody tell me right now that we do not have that ambassador standing in my booking room in handcuffs." The Range Rover, it turned out, carried an armored tamper alert that fired automatically the moment anyone attempted to move it without the key fob present. Ashworth had not asked for it to be towed. He had not needed to ask for anything at all. The vehicle itself had already begun making calls he hadn't made yet. Hartley's gaze swept the room and landed on the tall, soaked, impeccably composed black man, standing at the booking counter in cuffs, surrounded by his own officers. The captain's face went the color of the wet concrete outside. "Oh my God," he breathed. Whitmore took one step backward. For the first time all night, the smugness on his face cracked, just slightly, like the first hairline fracture in a windshield. "Whoever cuffed him," Hartley said, his voice climbing. "Get those cuffs off him this instant." Calloway had the key in the lock before he finished the sentence. The cuffs clicked open. Ashworth rubbed the raw, reddened skin at his wrists, slowly, deliberately, and looked at Hartley with an expression that held no relief in it at all, only a kind of exhausted, arriving certainty, the look of a man confirming something he had already known was true. "I want my phone," Ashworth said. "I'm calling the Secretary of State's Operations Center, and I want the name and badge number of every officer who touched me tonight. Here's where I need you to understand something, because it matters for what comes later." Ashworth did not smile. He did not gloat. In diplomacy, the worst outcomes are the ones people celebrate too early. He simply asked, calmly, for exactly what the law entitled him to. That calm was about to become the loudest thing in the entire building. Captain Hartley's office was a cramped, cigar-scented room with faded commendations on the walls and a window unit air conditioner that rattled every 90 seconds. Tonight, it became the improvised command post for a crisis that had already climbed past the building and into two federal agencies. Ashworth sat behind the captain's own desk, having claimed the chair the moment he walked in, his ruined suit jacket draped over the back of it, his father's fountain pen resting on the blotter in front of him, retrieved from the Range Rover's passenger seat by a very nervous diplomatic security escort within the hour. "Mr. Ambassador," Hartley said, hovering near the door, "we have coffee, dry clothes. I want you to know that this department will handle—" "Do not offer me coffee," Ashworth interrupted, his tone entirely without heat, which somehow made it worse. "At this moment, agents from the Diplomatic Security Service are securing my vehicle. Within the hour, I expect the Federal Bureau of Investigation to arrive, because your officer has committed felony assault, unlawful detention, and a direct violation of Title 18, Section 112 of the United States Code, Protection of Foreign Officials. This is not a matter for an internal review board, Captain. This is a federal crime scene." He had not finished the sentence before the precinct's front doors slammed open hard enough to rattle the glass. 6 agents in dark windbreakers, stamped FBI, strode through the booking room like a tide moving through a narrow channel, parting local officers without slowing down. At their front was Special Agent Vanessa Cole, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with the flat, unhurried authority of someone who had walked into far worse rooms than this one. "Who is the commanding officer of this facility?" Cole said. And it was not a question so much as a demand for compliance. "I am," Hartley said, stepping out of his own office looking smaller than he had 5 minutes earlier. "Agent Cole. As of right now, the Bureau has jurisdiction over this precinct's evidence and records. Nobody touches a terminal. Nobody deletes a file. Pull every body camera, dash camera, and internal recording from the last 3 hours. If a single second is missing, I will personally charge the shift commander with obstruction. Whitmore, standing near the water cooler, with his arms crossed in a posture that was trying very hard to look unbothered, suddenly looked like a man who had just noticed the floor tilting. Cole walked into the captain's office and extended a hand to Ashworth. "Ambassador, I'm told you're not seriously injured." Special Agent Vanessa Cole, sent at the direct request of the Secretary of State's office. "Bruised wrists, Agent Cole. Nothing that won't heal. My patience, on the other hand, is entirely finished." "Understood, sir. Your vehicle is secured. A federal driver is waiting for you whenever you're ready to leave." "I'm not leaving yet," Ashworth said, standing, buttoning his jacket. He walked out into the bullpen, where every officer in the room had gone very still, watching the man who had just brought the full weight of the federal government down onto their precinct in under an hour. His eyes found Whitmore across the room and held there. "Agent Cole," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the space, "that is the officer who assaulted me, ignored my federally issued credentials, and detained me without cause." Cole turned her gaze on Whitmore like a searchlight, name and badge number. "Officer Dale Whitmore. Badge 6214. His voice cracked on the second syllable of his own name. "You are hereby ordered to surrender your service weapon, your taser, and your radio, pending a joint investigation into civil rights violations and unlawful detention of a foreign diplomat." "You can't do that," Whitmore said, panic finally breaking through the swagger. "I'm Union. I had reasonable suspicion. The vehicle was. He was driving suspicious. The neighborhood. You had the right to run a federally registered plate," Cole said, stepping close enough that Whitmore actually flinched. "You chose not to. Hand over your weapon now." His hands shook as he unclipped his gun belt and set it on the nearest desk. The thud of the loaded service pistol hitting the wood sounded, in that silent room, like a verdict being read aloud. "Mr. Ambassador," Cole said, turning back, "we'll need a formal statement, but it can wait until tomorrow, at your convenience, wherever you'd like it taken." 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Ashworth said, City Hall. "And I expect the mayor and the police commissioner both in the room." As he walked toward the exit, he passed Officer Bell, who was standing near his desk, still soaked, still trembling faintly, clutching a paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Ashworth stopped in front of him. "You knew," he said quietly, meant only for Bell. "You held the truth in your hands tonight, and you still followed him. Remember exactly how that feels, officer. A badge has never once made a man immune from the truth." He walked out into the rain without looking back. He didn't need to. He had already lit the fuse. And now all that remained was watching where the fire went. The next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving Atlanta washed pale and merciless under a wide October's sky. Word had leaked overnight, the way it always does when 6 federal agents raid a municipal police station over a UN diplomat. Local news was already running a chyron that read Policedeton sitting ambassador, federal probe launched, and Mayor Gregory Simmons had not slept. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doors of the mayor's conference room opened, and Ashworth walked in, wearing a fresh Navy suit, flanked by Naomi Reyes, senior legal counsel for the UN mission, and Agent Cole. He took the chair directly across from the mayor, without waiting to be invited to sit. Beside Simmons sat Police Commissioner Elaine Ford, gray-faced and exhausted, and Frank Delgado, the union representative, already shuffling through a legal pad, like a man bracing for a fight he suspected he had already lost. "Mr. Ambassador," Simmons began, his tone dripping with rehearsed contrition, "let me begin by offering the full and unreserved apology of this city. What happened was an aberration. Save the speech." "Mayor," Ashworth said, his voice level, absolutely without anger, which was somehow far more unsettling than shouting would have been. "We are not here for apologies. We are here to discuss consequences." Commissioner Ford leaned forward. Ambassador, I assure you, Internal Affairs has already fast-tracked this. Officer Whitmore has been suspended, with pay pending review. With pay, Ashworth repeated, one eyebrow lifting a fraction of an inch. A paid vacation for a federal crime. How remarkably efficient. With all due respect, Delgado cut in. My client was working a high-value corridor in a torrential downpour. He made a judgment call about an unfamiliar ID under difficult conditions. It was an error, not malice. Ashworth looked at Delgado the way a man studies an insect he finds mildly interesting, but ultimately beneath serious consideration. A good faith error, he murmured. He turned. Naomi Reyes opened a leather folder and slid 3 bound copies across the table. One to the mayor, one to the commissioner, one directly in front of Delgado, who did not open his. What is this? He demanded. That, Agent Cole answered from the corner of the room, is a federally declassified summary of Officer Whitmore's sealed disciplinary file, subpoenaed by the Department of Justice at 3:15 this morning. Commissioner Ford opened hers first. The color drained from her face by the second page. Allow me to summarize it for the room. Since Mr. Delgado seems reluctant, Ashworth said, and his voice rang with a clarity that filled every corner of the space. In the last 9 years, Officer Whitmore has been the subject of 16 excessive force complaints. 13 were filed by Black or Latino motorists. This city has quietly settled 4 of them out of court for a combined total of $1.8 million. And through union protection and administrative cowardice, he remained on patrol, armed, unsupervised, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. Last night, that conviction became an international incident. Those complaints were never substantiated, Delgado argued, a bead of sweat forming at his temple, despite the room's air conditioning. I can use a sealed file, and I will, Ashworth said, his voice rising for the first time, cutting cleanly through the room. Because last night, his unsubstantiated bias became a matter of federal law. He nodded to Agent Cole, who lifted a small remote and pointed it at the television mounted on the far wall. The screen came alive with high-definition, unredacted dashcam footage. The room watched in absolute silence as the video played. The blinding flashlight, the diplomatic card tossed into the mud, Whitmore's voice, crystal clear over the storm, sneering an ambassador. Get a load of this guy. Where'd you steal the car? The footage cut to Whitmore kicking Ashworth's legs apart on the wet shoulder, cuffing his wrists hard enough that the strain was visible even on camera. Then it went black. The silence in that conference room afterward had a physical weight to it. Mayor Simmons looked, for a moment, as though he might actually be sick. Commissioner Ford stared at the blank screen, jaw tight, understanding with total clarity that no union representative on Earth could spin what she had just watched. That is not a misunderstanding, Ashworth said into the silence. That is racial profiling, arrogance, and gross incompetence captured on federal video. And if this city attempts to sweep it away, I will play that footage on a loop in the halls of the United Nations General Assembly, and I will tell every delegation in that room exactly how Atlanta treats a foreign diplomat with the wrong color of skin. Simmons swallowed. What would satisfy you, Ambassador? I don't negotiate with municipalities, Ashworth said coldly. But I will offer you one path away from a civil rights suit that will bankrupt your department. First, Officer Whitmore is not suspended. He is terminated, today, for cause forfeiting his pension and his certification. Second, I expect full cooperation with the Department of Justice's coming review of this precinct's pattern of conduct, or the Bureau will dismantle it piece by piece. He rose, buttoned his jacket, and leaned across the polished table, his eyes locked on the commissioners. I hold full immunity, Commissioner. You do not. By close of business today, I expect to see that badge sitting on this table. He turned and walked out without waiting for a response. He did not need one. He had already lit the second fuse, and this one was shorter than the first. The offices of the Patrolmen's Union felt suffocating. That afternoon, thick with humidity, the building's old air conditioning couldn't touch. Dale Whitmore sat in a cracked leather chair, his knee bouncing with a frantic, wired energy, waiting for Frank Delgado to return from City Hall. He had convinced himself, the way men like Whitmore always do, that this was survivable. He'd weathered internal reviews before, and the union had always found a way to make the paperwork disappear. Delgado walked in an hour later looking 10 years older. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a paper cup, drank it in one motion, and finally looked at Whitmore with an expression that held no sympathy at all. Only the exhausted calculation of a man cutting his losses before they became his own. "You're done, Dale," he said. "Come on, Mike, tell me we beat this." "I can protect you from an angry review board," Delgado said, his voice rising. "I have protected you from 16 complaints that should have had you fired 5 years ago. But I cannot protect you from the Department of State, the FBI, and the Department of Justice, all at once, on federal video." It was a dark highway, Whitmore said, his bravado cracking down the middle. He was arrogant. "I made a call. You made a choice," Delgado said. On high-definition federal video, the ambassador gave the mayor an ultimatum: fire you today for cause, or the DOJ opens an investigation into this entire precinct and sues the city into the ground. Nobody in that building is going to let the federal government occupy their department to save your career. "They can't just fire me without a hearing," Whitmore shouted, desperation finally cracking through. "I have rights." "Your rights ended the moment you illegally detained a foreign diplomat," Delgado said. "That's a federal crime, Dale. Agent Cole is waiting to see if the commissioner fires you today, because if she doesn't, the Bureau walks into your living room tonight and arrests you under Title 18. You are looking at federal prison." The word prison landed on Whitmore like a physical blow. His knees buckled, and he sank back into the chair, staring at the floor, his breathing gone shallow and fast. "Pension," he whispered. "Gone," Delgado said. "Terminated for cause means you forfeit it. Your certification is revoked. You will never wear a badge again in this state or any other. The commissioner is expecting you in 20 minutes to surrender your shield. Walk in, keep your mouth shut, and hand it over. Fight it, and the federal government eats you alive." The walk to Commissioner Ford's office felt, to Whitmore, like a march to an execution. Officers he'd shared beers with the weekly before suddenly found their own shoe tops fascinating as he passed. The unwritten code that had shielded him for 16 years had not simply cracked. The federal government had driven straight through it. Commissioner Ford stood behind her desk when he entered, flanked by Chief of Department Arthur Kessler, whose face looked carved from stone. Neither offered him a seat. "Officer Whitmore," Ford said, her voice devoid of any warmth at all, effective immediately. "Your employment with this department is terminated for conduct unbecoming an officer, gross insubordination, unlawful detention, and direct violation of federal protocol regarding diplomatic immunity." Whitmore's jaw locked so tight his teeth ached. "I gave 16 years to this city," he said, his voice trembling between rage and terror. 16 years dealing with the worst this city has to offer, and you're throwing me away over one traffic stop." Kessler's voice was a low rumble. "You didn't give 16 years to this city, officer. You spent 16 years using a badge to bully people you assumed couldn't fight back. Last night you pulled over someone who could, and he broke you clean." "Put the badge on the desk," Ford said. Whitmore's hand hovered over his chest, where the silver shield had sat for 16 years. His identity, his authority, his entire sense of who he was in the world. Without it, he understood with sudden, crushing clarity, he was simply an unemployed man facing federal charges. He unclipped it slowly, staring at the engraved numbers until his vision blurred, and set it down on the polished wood. It made a small, final sound. Even then, And this is the part you should notice, because it tells you everything about a man like Dale Whitmore. He did not say I was wrong. He said quietly, almost to himself, I was just doing my job. He never once, not that day and not in any of the weeks that followed, said the words, I'm sorry. Some men cannot say them even when the alternative is losing everything. Whitmore was one of those men, and it was that same stubborn refusal to bend that had put him in this office in the first place. Meanwhile, Officer Marcus Bell sat in a windowless FBI interview room downtown, a paper cup of cold coffee untouched in front of him, across the table from Agent Cole, and a digital recorder whose red light blinked steadily. Officer Bell, Cole said, you are currently considered a witness, not a subject, in this investigation. That status depends entirely on your complete honesty right now. Bell looked at the blinking light. Testifying against a fellow officer, even a disgraced and fired one, broke every unwritten rule of the culture he'd sworn into 18 months earlier. But he kept hearing Ashworth's voice from the night before. A badge has never once made a man immune from the truth. And it would not let him go. I'll tell you everything, he said, his voice quiet but steady. I warned him. I told him the ID looked real, that the plate had a D prefix. He told me to shut up. He said he knew a stolen ride and a fake ID when he saw one. He didn't care about protocol. He saw a black man in an expensive truck and made up his mind before he even got out of the cruiser. Did he use excessive force? Cole asked. Yes. He kicked the ambassador's legs apart, shoved him against the vehicle, cuffed him tighter than necessary. The ambassador wasn't resisting. He cited federal law, and Whitmore laughed at him. Bell looked down at his own trembling hands. I should have stopped it. I should have physically stepped in. You were a rookie on a dark highway with an unstable senior partner, Cole said, her tone softening by exactly 1 degree. You made a mistake by staying silent. You're making the right call now. Your statement is going to help us open the sealed files on 4 other officers in that precinct with the same pattern of complaints. Bell exhaled a long, shaking breath. He felt something strange settle in his chest. Not pride, not relief. Something closer to the first honest moment he'd had since he put on the uniform. High above the traffic and rain-washed streets of Atlanta, in a corner office of the UN Mission's regional building, the air was cool, quiet, and entirely unlike the chaos of the night before. Ambassador Julian Ashworth sat behind his desk in a fresh gray suit, a cup of Earl Grey steaming beside a stack of files, his bruised wrists still faintly aching. His father's fountain pen sat capped on the blotter in front of him, exactly where it always sat when there was something worth writing down. Naomi Reyes entered carrying a single slim folder. Good afternoon, Ambassador. Do we have confirmation? We do. She laid the folder open. Officer Dale Whitmore was terminated for cause at 4:40 this afternoon. Pension revoked. Certification canceled. The Department of Justice has opened a formal pattern and practice review of the 14th Precinct. 4 other officers with matching disciplinary histories have been placed on leave pending federal interviews. Officer Bell is cooperating fully. Ashworth read the document without smiling, without any satisfaction at all. Only the flat, careful attention of a man, confirming that a difficult job had been done correctly. A necessary excision, he said quietly. Power, without accountability, is a rot. It spreads until someone finally has the will to cut it out. You wielded that immunity like a scalpel, sir, Reyes said, closing the folder. Ashworth stood and walked to the window, looking down at the small, unhurried river of headlights along Peachtree Street. He thought about his father mopping marble floors 31 years, invisible to men who never once looked up from their briefcases to see him. He thought about the fountain pen and what it had been for. Draft a message to the secretary's office, he said finally. Tell them the matter has been resolved to my satisfaction. No further federal action is required on my behalf. Right away, Ambassador, Reyes said, then paused at the door. It's a good day for justice, sir. Justice is rarely swift, Ashworth said, lifting his tea. But when it finally arrives, it should be complete. 4 months later, on a bright, ordinary Tuesday, the 14th precinct looked different in ways that had nothing to do with fresh paint. A mandatory bias awareness curriculum, developed jointly with the Department of Justice and quietly nicknamed the Ashworth Protocol by officers who never said the name to reporters, ran every new recruit through 11 hours of case study before they were issued a badge. Sergeant Renee Calloway, promoted to lieutenant, taught 2 of those hours herself, using nothing but 19 minutes of unredacted dashcam footage and total silence afterward, letting the recruits sit with what they'd just watched before she said a single word. Officer Marcus Bell had been reassigned to community relations, a job he hadn't asked for and initially resented, until he stood in front of his first classroom of high schoolers in Chaston Hills and realized that telling the truth about one bad night, in detail, without flinching, was doing more good than 18 months of routine patrol ever had. Of Whitmore, there was less to say, and that was, in its own way, the point. He worked, briefly, as a security guard at a strip mall in a county 2 hours south, a job that required no certification and paid $14 an hour. He was indicted on federal charges under Title 18, 4 months after his termination, and pleaded to a reduced count rather than risk trial. He never once, in any court filing, any deposition, any interview, said the words "I was wrong." He said to the very end that he had simply been doing his job in difficult conditions. Some men would rather lose everything than admit they were the storm. On a quiet Sunday morning in March, Ambassador Julian Ashworth drove. Alone this time. No security detail, no briefing papers on the passenger seat, to the Harry S. Truman Building in Washington, D.C. He walked through the same marble lobby his father had mopped for 31 years, past a small brass plaque near the west stairwell that the department had, at his quiet request, installed 18 months earlier, honoring the facilities and custodial staff whose labor sustains this institution. Seen and unseen, 1962 present. He stood there a long moment in the morning light, slanting through the tall windows, took the old fountain pen from his breast pocket, uncapped it, and signed his name in the small guest ledger chained beside the plaque, the way he did every single time he passed through that lobby now, a private ritual no one else was ever meant to notice. Then he capped the pen, slipped it back into his pocket, and walked out through the front doors, exactly the way his father had once told him he would, into a wide, ordinary Washington morning that asked nothing of him at all.